Sir, this section is for business class only. The flight attendant's voice didn't just carry instructions, it carried judgment. Thaddeus Avery looked up from his paperback novel, slowly folding the page corner to mark his place. The cabin light above seat 3A cast a narrow halo across the open page. But it wasn't the words that had kept his attention. It was the silence that followed hers. The kind of silence that wasn't accidental. A silence heavy with implication. He had known this might happen. Expected it, even. That morning, in the soft gray light of his Pasadena townhouse, he had stood before the mirror and left the Armani blazer hanging untouched. Instead, he chose a navy polo, jeans pressed but not flashy, and leather sneakers that had seen more than a few miles. It was deliberate. Every inch of him today had been crafted to invite assumption. Let them see what they want to see. Flight 377 from Los Angeles to Chicago was one of Silver Wing Airlines' busiest business class routes. Suited consultants, attorneys reviewing case briefs, real estate developers flipping through prospectuses, all of them moved through this corridor like stock tickers. Polished, hurried, entitled. And now, amid them, sat Thaddeus, silent and unmoved, becoming the question mark in their polished equation. He had designed this very cabin years ago, back when he fought tooth and nail for Silverwing to compete with the Giants' Delta, United American. He had selected the leather for these very seats, measured the spacing, debated over lighting hues and tray table finishes. But today, he boarded with no title, no assistant, no press badge, just a boarding pass and a mind full of questions. He wasn't here for travel. He was here for proof. The flight attendant was still standing there, her arms now folded, posture sharpened. Her badge read Clarissa Denton, a name that sounded like it had attended etiquette school. Her eyes scanned him again, from shoes to stubble. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass," she said. Passengers in nearby seats slowed their conversations. A man in 4A lowered his newspaper. A woman 2 rows ahead clutched her designer purse a little tighter. Thaddeus could feel it, the air pulling tight like fabric at the seam. He reached into the side pocket of his laptop case and produced the boarding stub. Clarissa took it, glanced quickly, and hesitated. Her jaw didn't drop, but her nostrils flared. She looked again, eyebrows twitching. Interesting," she said, then forced a closed-lip smile. "I'll be back." She pivoted and walked up the aisle with the clipped heels of someone used to getting answers. Thaddeus knew she wasn't finished, not even close. In the galley near the front, Naomi Brooks stood quietly behind a half-pulled curtain. Younger than Clarissa by at least a decade, Naomi was folding napkins with quiet precision, listening. She had noticed the man in 3A. Not because he made a fuss, he didn't, but because of how still he was. Stillness, she'd learned, was often louder than words. Clarissa returned 2 minutes later, this time without the smile. "There may have been an error," she announced, her voice no longer private. "This seat is usually reserved for our full-fare business clientele, sir. Perhaps you were upgraded by mistake." No one spoke, but the silence that followed was anything but neutral. Thaddeus didn't blink. "It's not a mistake." Clarissa's neck stiffened. "I'm sure, but I'd like to verify it with the manifest." As she turned away again, Gregory Vance stepped into view. He had boarded just moments before and spotted Thaddeus immediately. Mid-50s, Yale ring still shiny on his finger, Gregory wore the smirk of someone who'd never had to explain his presence. He didn't speak yet, but his eyes told a story. He slid into seat 2C, adjusted his cufflinks, and kept watching. Back in the galley, Naomi heard the conversation fragment through the intercom. She stepped out, quietly approached the service monitor, and accessed the seating chart. There it was. Seat 3A, Avery T. Full fare. No upgrade. No special status override. She swallowed and turned toward the aisle. "Clarissa," she said, catching her at row 2. "I just checked the manifest. That seat was purchased, full fare. He's listed right there." Clarissa stared at her. "You're sure?" "Positive. No flags. Everything cleared." Clarissa looked past her shoulder toward 3A. Thaddeus had resumed reading, or at least appeared to. Her voice lowered, but not enough. "Well, maybe someone will explain to him how these things work," she muttered, not quite under her breath. And that was when Gregory leaned toward the aisle, voice loud enough to bounce off the bulkhead. "Maybe next time you people can sit where you're supposed to. Save us all the drama." The words sliced through the cabin like turbulence. The woman in 4B gasped. A man in row 5 dropped his phone. Naomi's jaw set. Thaddeus looked up, not in anger, but like a man closing a file cabinet in his mind. Quietly, he pulled his phone from his pocket and typed, "Code blue. Gate 18. Immediate response." He returned the phone to his lap and resumed reading. Back near the galley, Naomi paused at the coffee station, then walked over. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked. "Yes, thank you," Thaddeus replied, eyes not leaving the page. "Let's just say I won't be needing the in-flight entertainment today." Clarissa passed behind her, brushing close, but saying nothing. Naomi didn't look away from Thaddeus. Back at the front, the cockpit door opened, and out stepped the captain. Elliot Parrish, mid-40s, calm but alert. He'd been flying for 2 decades, mostly uneventful routes, but something in Clarissa's voice over the comm had tightened his instincts. "What's the issue?" he asked. "Passenger in 3A, Clarissa said, keeping her voice even. "He's refusing to comply with seat verification. It's unclear." "Unclear how?" "We didn't see him during boarding. Name's not familiar. Attire doesn't fit." Parrish frowned. "He has a ticket?" "Yes, but that should be the end of it." Clarissa didn't reply. The captain walked the aisle. As he reached 3A, Thaddeus slowly stood, not defiantly, but with quiet intention. He extended a hand. "Good afternoon, Captain." "Sir," Parrish said, "can we clear this up? Do you have identification?" Thaddeus reached into his wallet and pulled out a card, black, matte, no embellishment. Parrish took it, turned it over, and his eyebrows shot up. "Thaddeus Avery, Chief Executive Officer, Silver Wing Airlines." The silence behind him became a vacuum. Parrish blinked. "Mr. Avery, Thaddeus raised a hand. "Let's not make a scene, Captain. I've already sent word to corporate. Your job now is to keep the cabin calm. I'll take it from here." Parrish nodded once, stunned, and returned to the front. Clarissa saw his face and backed a step. For the first time, something shifted in her eyes. Not apology. Not yet. But fear. Thaddeus sat back down, unfolded his page, and resumed reading. Naomi passed by, paused beside him. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" "Water, please. Room temperature." She nodded and walked away. 2 rows ahead, Gregory Vance no longer looked smug. He pulled out his phone but didn't open it, just stared at the screen, unmoving. Across the cabin, a hush had taken over. Not awkward anymore, but reverent, as if the passengers were beginning to understand that they hadn't just watched a man defend a seat. They had watched him claim a truth that most of them never even questioned. And from somewhere deep in the fuselage, a new kind of pressure began to build, one that had nothing to do with altitude. Thaddeus turned the page slowly, his fingers steady. The book in his lap wasn't fiction anymore. And at that very moment, from the forward galley, the soft chime of the cockpit call rang out. Clarissa Denton turned her head, her posture stiffened. And then, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Clarissa, please report to the flight deck immediately." She vanished behind the curtain. Thaddeus didn't move. He didn't need to. He had taken his seat. And now, he was watching who else would take theirs. Thaddeus reaches calmly into his pocket, types 6 words into his phone. "Code blue, gate 18, immediate response." She didn't whisper. She didn't pull him aside. She broadcasted it loud enough for every seat to hear. The air inside the cabin had grown still, heavier somehow. The hum of the aircraft systems and the occasional shuffle of a boarding passenger's bag felt distant, muffled beneath the weight of Clarissa's words still hanging in the air. The seat was his. Verified. Confirmed. And yet she had announced, with the confidence of someone expecting compliance, that he didn't belong. Earlier that month, Thaddeus had read through a letter from a grandmother in Cincinnati. She'd flown to Atlanta on one of Silverwing's routes, ticketed for a first-class seat, gifted by her children for her 70th birthday. "They asked me 3 times if I was lost," she wrote. 3 times before I even sat down. That letter was still folded neatly in his leather notebook. Now, seated in the very space he had designed, Thaddeus was no longer reading about the problem. He was living it. He didn't need to perform anger. That wasn't his power. His power was steadiness, the kind that made people check themselves without him needing to raise his voice. Still, the silence in the cabin cut deep. Not a single person had spoken up. They had heard it all, and yet no one had moved, not even to shift in their seats. A few rows away, Naomi Brooks hovered near the galley curtain. The monitor in front of her confirmed what she already knew. Avery, T, Seat 3A. Full fare, confirmed. No upgrades, no discounts. There was no procedural ambiguity left. And yet something in her still paused. Years of subtle hierarchies had taught her to be cautious, especially when correcting someone with more tenure, more presence. Clarissa had a sharpness to her, the kind that could shred reputations with a few choice words. But what Naomi also had, tucked quietly behind her reserve, was integrity. Clarissa's heels clicked back into the aisle. She glanced again at Thaddeus, face composed now, but her lips were drawn taut, the way people looked when they couldn't undo a mistake but weren't ready to admit it. "Sir," she said again, slower this time, as if trying to reclaim politeness. "We're still waiting to verify everything. In the meantime, we ask for your patience." "I've been patient," Thaddeus replied, calmly. "Now I'm just watching." That sentence landed softly, but it rang through the cabin. Watching. Not yelling, not accusing, just observing. From the row ahead, Gregory Vance shifted. His body language betrayed discomfort. Just 15 minutes earlier, he had glanced at Thaddeus as if assessing a threat to his personal space. Now he couldn't even meet the man's eyes. Naomi took a breath and moved down the aisle toward Clarissa. "I double-checked the manifest," she said, voice low but deliberate. "He's on the list. Seat 3A, paid in full." Clarissa looked at her sharply. "Thank you, Naomi," she said, the words clipped. "I'll handle it." But Naomi didn't retreat. She stood just slightly off to the side, near the jump seat, folding her hands behind her back. Her body language was respectful, but present. Meanwhile, Thaddeus leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, his mind was working. The text he'd sent, Code Blue, Gate 18, was a rarely used internal protocol. A handful of corporate officers, including Malcolm Tate, the new vice president of corporate operations, had been trained to respond immediately if that code was activated. Malcolm had only been on the job for 5 weeks. Young, precise, the kind of executive who wore slim ties and carried a Bluetooth earpiece like it was sewn into his skin. If Thaddeus had read him right, Malcolm would already be en route. And then it came the subtle shift. The cabin door remained open longer than usual. One of the ground staff paused near the bridge, and then, from outside the window, the unmistakable shape of a black SUV pulled up to the edge of the gate. Inside, the passengers were beginning to sense something. They weren't sure what, not yet. But the energy in this cabin had changed. This was no longer an awkward moment between a passenger and a flight attendant. It was becoming something else. Naomi stepped forward again. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" she asked. Thaddeus looked at her. There was no pity in her voice, no awkwardness, just professionalism, steadiness. He nodded once. "Water. Room temperature, if possible." She nodded and disappeared behind the curtain. 2 seats ahead, Gregory cleared his throat, then turned halfway in his seat. "Look," he said, voice louder than necessary. "No offense meant earlier. I just think the world's gotten so sensitive. Everyone's ready to be offended these days." Thaddeus didn't look up. He turned another page in his book. The gesture was subtle, but its meaning was clear. In the cockpit, Captain Elliot Parrish listened to Clarissa's report with increasing discomfort. "You didn't check the manifest first?" he asked. "She didn't look like she belonged there," Clarissa said flatly. He stood from his seat and stepped out. It was time to face it head on. As Captain Parrish approached seat 3A, Thaddeus rose slowly, not defensively, but with that same internal gravity that had steadied every room he'd ever walked into. "Good afternoon, Captain," he said, voice even. "Good afternoon, sir. I understand there's been some confusion with your seating." Thaddeus nodded and extended a card. Parrish took it, read it, stopped. His tone shifted instantly. "Mr. Avery, No need," Thaddeus replied calmly. "I've already contacted corporate. They'll be here shortly." Captain Parrish nodded, unsure of whether to say more. He turned and returned to the flight deck, murmuring something into the intercom. At the front of the cabin, the main door opened once more. Malcolm Tate entered, flanked by 2 uniformed airport supervisors. His movements were quick, controlled. He scanned the aisle, locked eyes with Thaddeus, and approached. To the rest of the cabin, it looked like 2 professionals meeting briefly. But the energy told another story. "Apologies for the delay, everyone," Malcolm said, turning to face the passengers. "We're just addressing a procedural issue. We appreciate your patience." Then, quietly to Thaddeus, "I came as fast as I could." Thaddeus gave a slight nod. "Let's resolve this privately. Then we'll decide what happens next." Clarissa stood frozen near the galley, her eyes tracking every movement. The moment she saw Malcolm step aboard, her face blanched. She wasn't just dealing with an unhappy customer. She had challenged the man who signed the checks. Naomi, standing near the jump seat, caught her eye just for a second. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat, but her expression said everything. "You messed with the wrong man." The energy in the plane shifted again, not from fear, from realization. From the passengers who had said nothing, to those who had watched in silence, something was sinking in. This wasn't just about a seat. It never was. And as Malcolm and Thaddeus walked toward the jet bridge, the hush in the cabin deepened. Not awkward, not even ashamed, just heavy, just true. Gregory slouched a little more in his seat. Linda Chu, seated quietly in row 5, looked toward the galley curtain and back to 3A, her lips pressed in a thin, tight line. For a long stretch, no one said a word. Naomi passed through with a water bottle, placed it on the tray in 3A, and smoothed her apron. And then the captain's voice came on overhead. "Clarissa, please report to the flight deck immediately." "Do you have any form of ID?" the captain asked. Thaddeus nodded and handed him a business card as plain as stone. The silence in the cabin after that gesture didn't break, it deepened. It wasn't the quiet of inattention, but the silence that comes when everyone realizes they've misread the moment. Clarissa Denton stood a few paces behind the captain, frozen. She had leaned in to listen, expecting compliance, maybe a retort, maybe embarrassment. What she didn't expect was that plain black card, simple lettering, no flourish, just a name: Thaddeus Avery, Chief Executive Officer, Silverwing Airlines. Captain Elliot Parrish looked up from the card, his mouth slightly open. In his 20 years of flying, he'd handled medical emergencies, mechanical delays, even the occasional belligerent customer. But nothing like this. Nothing that revealed how deeply his assumptions had settled in over the years. "Mr. Avery, the captain began, but Thaddeus lifted a hand. "Let's not make a scene, Captain," he said gently. "I've already sent word to corporate. Your job now is to keep this cabin calm while we address this at the gate." His voice wasn't sharp, it wasn't loud, but it landed like a hammer. A steady, confident reminder of who he was and what he carried. Captain Parrish nodded quickly, turned without another word, and walked toward the cockpit. Clarissa stared after him, her face pale. She no longer looked authoritative. She looked lost. Outside the plane, the jet bridge was now sealed, but behind the scenes, the wheels were already in motion. Malcolm Tate had received the message 6 minutes earlier, and by the time he stepped through the gate at LAX, he wasn't just carrying his badge, he was carrying resolve. As one of the youngest VPs in Silverwing's history, Malcolm had built his reputation on execution, discretion, and keeping the company out of headlines. But this wasn't something he could patch with a press release. Inside the aircraft, Naomi Brooks watched the unfolding moment from the galley with a mixture of awe and unease. She hadn't heard everything, but she'd seen enough. The stillness in seat 3A, the way the captain's tone shifted, the glance Clarissa cast toward the rear after reading the card. All of it told her something fundamental had just changed. Passengers, too, were reacting, not with words, not yet, but with posture. The woman in 4B, who had clutched her pearls earlier, now stared at the floor. A man in 2D slowly closed his laptop and looked toward Thaddeus with a new kind of attention. Gregory Vance shifted again in his seat, folding and unfolding his hands, as if trying to decide whether shame or justification suited him better. Thaddeus remained seated, calm, composed. He had nothing to prove but a system to expose. At the front of the cabin, the door opened again. Malcolm entered with 2 uniformed airport supervisors and scanned the room. He spotted Thaddeus instantly, nodded once, and turned to face the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice clear and professional, "we apologize for the delay. There's been a procedural issue that needs to be resolved before we can depart. Thank you for your understanding." Then he stepped to Thaddeus's row and lowered his voice. "Sir, may we speak privately?" Thaddeus rose slowly, tucked his book into his leather bag, and adjusted his collar. Clarissa stepped backward, her spine pressed subtly against the bulkhead wall. For the first time since boarding, her arms were no longer crossed. As Thaddeus moved down the aisle, the weight of every gaze followed him. He didn't look around. He didn't have to. People were no longer unsure of who he was. They were now unsure of who they had been in that moment of silence. The man they had watched being questioned was not a misseated traveler. He was the architect of the flight itself. Inside the jet bridge, Thaddeus, Malcolm, and the two supervisors stood in a small space meant for logistics, not confrontation. There was no air conditioning, just filtered terminal air and the hum of metal. Malcolm spoke first. "I'm sorry," he said, eyes steady. "There's no excuse for what just happened." "I didn't come here for apologies," Thaddeus said. "I came to see if what I've been reading was isolated, or if it was systemic." Malcolm nodded. "We can ground the flight, reassign crew. Start the audit now." Thaddeus shook his head. "Not yet. I want to go back in. I want to see who finds their voice, who stays silent. That's where the truth lives." He turned and stepped back toward the door. Malcolm paused, watching him with something between admiration and concern. "Sir, there's another option. A private jet can be arranged. No further noise. No delay." Thaddeus glanced over his shoulder. "I didn't ask for comfort. I asked for clarity." With that, he reboarded. The moment he stepped back into the cabin, the atmosphere shifted again. This time it wasn't just tension. It was awareness. One by one, passengers turned toward him not out of curiosity, but with a kind of quiet reverence. Some nodded. Some looked away. But all of them knew something had just changed permanently. He walked back to 3A and sat down. Naomi was waiting beside him, hands folded. "Mr. Avery," she said gently, "can I get you something to drink?" He gave a small nod. "Water, please. Room temperature." She moved away, no longer just performing a task, but fulfilling a responsibility. Across the aisle, Gregory cleared his throat. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it earlier. It's just, the world moves fast. People get jumpy. You know how it is." Thaddeus didn't even lift his eyes from the book. He turned the page and let the silence answer. At the front of the aircraft, Clarissa remained near the jump seat. Her posture was unchanged, but her presence had dimmed. No longer a figure of authority, she was now a reminder, a warning, a case study in judgment. The cockpit door opened slightly. Captain Parrish peeked out, scanned the cabin, then retreated. The forward phone rang. Naomi answered it quickly, then turned toward Clarissa. "Captain wants to see you up front." Her tone was measured, but final. Clarissa didn't argue. She nodded, stepped past Naomi, and disappeared into the cockpit. She didn't return. As the main cabin lights dimmed for takeoff, Thaddeus opened his book again, though he knew he wouldn't be reading. Not really. What had just unfolded was far more pressing than any plot. He sat back in seat 3A, hands resting lightly on the open pages. Passengers slowly began to relax, not because everything was resolved, but because something had been acknowledged. A wrong had been named. The silence had cracked. From the window, the late afternoon sun threw a stripe of gold across the floor at Thaddeus's feet. He stared at it for a moment, then closed the book and set it aside. And then the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we taxi out, I want to personally acknowledge and apologize for any unprofessional behavior experienced by any passenger today. At Silverwing Airlines, we are committed to respect, safety, and equality for all passengers, regardless of what they wear, where they sit, or what they look like. Thank you for your understanding. The message ended. Several passengers looked around, unsure of how to respond. A few nodded quietly. Others murmured soft acknowledgments. Thaddeus closed his eyes not to sleep, but to breathe. Deeply. Fully. This flight was finally ready to take off. Clarissa stepped back into the galley, ghost-like. Naomi watched her go, then turned to Thaddeus. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" "No, thank you," Thaddeus said gently, when offered a private jet. "I'll stay in this seat with these people." The aircraft had climbed steadily into the late afternoon sky, leveling at cruising altitude over the Midwest. The clouds beneath them were thick and soft, stretched across the horizon like gauze. Inside the business class cabin, however, the air was taut with something unspoken. Stillness. Not the kind that suggested peace, but the kind that hung after something true had been exposed. Before takeoff, one of the uniformed airport supervisors had leaned in quietly, offering Thaddeus an exit. A luxury jet. No headlines, no press, no more eyes. But Thaddeus had declined, without hesitation. He'd chosen this seat for a reason, and he wasn't going to let them move him physically or symbolically. He had seen enough already. How easy it was for silence to settle in when dignity was questioned. How the first instinct of many was to look away. But now, the truth had weight. It had context. And for the first time, people in this cabin were feeling it press against them, not from turbulence, not from awareness. Thaddeus adjusted his seat slightly and glanced out the window. Chicago was still an hour and change away. That was more than enough time to observe what came next. Naomi Brooks approached with a bottle of water, held respectfully in both hands. She placed it on the tray table with care. "Room temperature, as requested," she said, voice soft. He gave a quiet nod. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry." "For the water?" he asked, with a slight tilt of his head. "For what happened before," she said. "I didn't know who you were. But even if I had, I should have said something sooner." Thaddeus studied her for a moment. Her eyes didn't waver. "You checked the manifest. You spoke up. That matters," he said. "We all come to courage on different timetables. What matters is that you arrive." She nodded once and returned to her post. Across the aisle, Gregory Vance had been squirming. He shifted again, crossing and uncrossing his legs, as if trying to get comfortable in a seat that now seemed to betray him. Finally, after a deep breath, he leaned toward Thaddeus. "I owe you an apology," he began. "Earlier, when I said, 'Look,' I didn't mean anything by it. I just think the world's gotten so sensitive." Thaddeus didn't look up. Gregory tried again. "It's just, these days, everything's a controversy. You sneeze wrong and someone files a complaint." Thaddeus slowly turned the page of his book. "What do you think it means to belong?" he asked, still not looking up. Gregory blinked. "What?" "You said the world's too sensitive. I'm asking, what do you think it means to belong? Is it how someone dresses? What seat they're in? The way they carry themselves?" Gregory fumbled. "I don't know. I guess I hadn't really thought about it." "Start there," Thaddeus said, then turned back to the window. Gregory said nothing else. From several rows behind, Linda Chu leaned gently into the aisle. Her voice was soft, but clear enough to carry. I want to say thank you, sir, for how you handled all that. Thaddeus glanced back and met her eyes. There was sincerity in her tone. Not performative, just human. No one should be treated like that, she continued. Not here, not anywhere. Her words hovered for a moment, then something surprising happened. Another passenger, a man in business attire near the bulkhead, added, "Yeah, that wasn't right. You handled that with real grace." One by one, others began nodding. A slow ripple of acknowledgement moved through the cabin, not applause, not ceremony, but something even rarer in air travel. Introspection. Naomi walked the aisle with a tray of coffee. She smiled faintly at Linda, then paused near Clarissa's jump seat. Clarissa sat still, her eyes locked on the galley door. She hadn't re-entered the cabin since speaking with the captain. Her silence now was not professional, it was protective. She had watched the power she once held drain quietly from the room, and she knew there was no regaining it. In the cockpit, Captain Parrish made a short entry in the flight log, noting the delay and the unusual mid-boarding intervention. He closed the tablet and sat back, running a hand over his face. "You all right, Captain?" asked the co-pilot. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Just thinking." He looked over at the secure channel open on his screen. Malcolm Tate had already messaged. The incident would trigger a full conduct review. Interviews. Retraining. Potential terminations. Back in the cabin, Thaddeus reached into his leather bag and pulled out a well-worn notebook. No logos, no corporate branding. Just pages marked by years of use. Inside, dozens of quotes from passengers, journal entries, notes from meetings with diversity consultants and former employees, stories people had been too afraid to share publicly. He flipped to a fresh page and began writing. Flight 377, Incident 1. Full internal audit of crew conduct. Past 90 days. 2. Mandatory equity and ethics training for all frontline staff. 3. Launch anonymous hotline. Speak freely. 4. Formal apology to affected passengers. Public, clear, direct. 5. Suspension of lead flight attendant. Pending review. 6. Recognize staff with integrity. Recommend Naomi Brooks for advancement. 7. Issue internal memo. Silence is complicity. He paused after the 7th item, tapping the pen against the page. Then added, 8. Reinforce message to leadership. Respect cannot be policy alone. It must be culture. The cabin remained calm, unusually so. No babies crying, no overhead bins rattling. Just the quiet hum of a pressurized environment now filled with something heavier than air. Accountability. In row 4A, a woman leaned toward Thaddeus. "I just want to say thank you. Not everyone would have stayed so composed," she said. "You reminded us of something today." He closed the notebook, resting his hand on it. "Sometimes dignity is the loudest thing in the room," he replied. She smiled. "You taught us something." "I didn't come to teach," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I came to see who we really are." The words lingered, not as an accusation, but as an invitation. From the forward galley, the cockpit phone rang. Naomi picked it up and listened. She turned to Clarissa. "Captain wants to see you up front," she said quietly. Clarissa didn't argue. She just stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked toward the cockpit. The door closed behind her, and for several minutes, she didn't return. When she did, her face was pale, her jaw clenched. She disappeared into the galley. She never re-entered the cabin. The sun had begun its slow descent over the horizon, casting golden streaks across the windows. Thaddeus adjusted his seat and took another sip of water. Then, from the seat behind him, a boy not more than 12 tapped his shoulder. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said. "Are you someone important?" Thaddeus turned and looked at him. The child's face was open, curious. "I'm someone who watched," he said, and then decided to speak. The boy nodded, as if that answer made more sense than anything he'd heard all day. In the cockpit, the flight attendant's incident report had just been closed, and in Thaddeus's notebook, one more line was added. "We've got work to do. But now, we've started." The forward intercom crackled again, and the captain's voice returned, even and composed. "We'll begin our descent into Chicago shortly. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Flight attendants, prepare for arrival." Thaddeus placed the notebook back in his bag and looked out the window, the clouds parting slowly. Clarissa Denton stepped back into the galley, ghost-like. Naomi watched her go, then turned to Thaddeus. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" He flipped open the worn leather notebook, turned to a blank page, and began writing. Flight 377. Incident Report Number 1. The plane sliced through the upper airways over Indiana, cruising smooth and high. But inside the cabin, the emotional altitude was still rising. Nothing about the cabin felt typical now. Tray tables had been lowered, laptops closed, idle screens glowing in the background. People were thinking, watching, recalculating their part in what had just unfolded. Thaddeus Avery, who just hours earlier had slipped into seat 3A unnoticed, was no longer just a passenger. His identity had surfaced, his silence had spoken, and now he wrote. The leather notebook had been with him for years, weathered edges, a stitched spine that creaked when opened wide. But today's page was heavier than usual. He didn't just write what had happened, he wrote what would happen next. Item by item, his pen pressed out clarity in neat lines. A full internal audit, new mandatory ethics training, a formal apology not coated in corporate varnish, but sharpened with sincerity. The reforms wouldn't begin once the wheels touched down, they'd begin here. At 35,000 feet, with no cameras, no PR firm, no podium, just a man reclaiming the culture he had helped build. From her position in the forward galley, Naomi Brooks watched him. She had already brought the water, already whispered her quiet apology, but she knew something else needed to happen. Something not procedural, something personal. She approached, not with a tray, but with a simple presence. "Sir," she said quietly, not wanting to draw attention. He looked up. "I've been thinking about what you said, about arriving at courage in our own time. I think I've been standing at the gate for a while, just never quite boarded." He closed the notebook slowly, giving her his full attention. "And today?" "I think I stepped on," she said. A faint smile formed on his face, subtle but real. "Then stay seated," he said. "We've got a long flight ahead." Meanwhile, 2 rows up, Gregory Vance looked as if he were sitting on thumbtacks. The corporate lawyer's usual ease had vanished. He kept fidgeting with his wedding band, twisting it slowly as if trying to distract himself from the heat of his own discomfort. Eventually, he turned halfway in his seat again. "Mr. Avery, I just want to clarify what I meant earlier. It wasn't that I don't care. I do. I didn't expect things to go this way." Thaddeus didn't shift. "You didn't expect someone like me to be in that seat," he said plainly. "You didn't expect to be called out by your silence. And now you're not sure whether to explain yourself or just disappear." Gregory blinked, swallowed. I'm not interested in regret, Thaddeus continued. I'm interested in reflection. Regret is for you. Reflection is for change. Gregory gave a small, slow nod. You're right. I have some thinking to do. Naomi stood to the side, her eyes on Gregory as well. She didn't say anything, but her gaze wasn't judgmental. It was instructive, like she was witnessing the first cracks in someone's armor. At the front of the aircraft, the cockpit was calm. Captain Elliot Parrish had returned to his logbook, but his mind kept drifting. He stared at the words he'd typed earlier. Passenger refusal of reassignment, and felt a pang of shame. He had entered it before knowing who Thaddeus was, before realizing what this flight was becoming. A private message from Malcolm Tate popped up on his screen. We're moving forward with full crew conduct audit. Begin compiling timeline. Discretion critical. Mr. Avery has requested no PR moves until landing. Captain Parrish responded, Understood. Full cooperation. Will include full crew names and decisions. No omissions. He exhaled. For the first time in his career, he felt the gravity of his choices in a new way. Not because they had consequences, but because someone with power had witnessed them. Back in seat 3A, Thaddeus opened his phone. Dozens of notifications flashed across the screen. Missed calls, unread texts, an email flagged urgent from the legal team. But one message stood out from his assistant. Board is watching. Legal panicking. Comm team prepping a statement. He locked the phone. Not yet. He turned back to the notebook, adding 2 final entries. 8. Naomi Brooks. Recommend advancement. Integrity under pressure. 9. Internal memo. Silence is complicity. Deliver across departments within 24 hours. The act of writing wasn't just for record-keeping, it was for recalibrating the compass of the airline. Every note was a gear turning toward a different culture. At that moment, Linda Chu stood again. Sir, she said, speaking to the entire cabin now, I think we owe you more than quiet support. I want to say that I watched, and I regret watching silently. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were firm. And I won't do that again. Soft nods followed from other passengers. A man near the exit row murmured, Same here. Naomi returned to the galley and leaned against the wall for a second. Her hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline. She looked down at her shoes, then out at the cabin, then quietly slipped into the forward phone station and dialed. Captain, she said, this is Naomi, just reporting that Mr. Avery's settled, and thank you for making the announcement earlier. It mattered. Parrish's voice came back, steady. Thank you, Naomi. We'll talk more after landing. And then in the background, a ping. Thaddeus's phone lit up again. A secure message. Malcolm Tate had sent a link to the internal camera footage, the cockpit surveillance that showed the exact moment Clarissa had spoken the words, "Move to the back or be removed." Thaddeus watched the first 20 seconds. Her posture, her volume, the way she turned to face the cabin to be heard. He paused the video and closed the window. That was enough. This wasn't about revenge, it was about repair. The plane began its slow descent into Chicago, the subtle shift in angle making ears pop and passengers sit up. Naomi walked the aisle checking belt. Clarissa remained in the galley, out of sight, her presence now more like a shadow than a leader. Thaddeus checked his watch. Olivia would be waiting. His daughter had texted him earlier. Text me when you land. I'll be at arrivals. Black coat, gate 6. He smiled to himself. She didn't know yet what had happened. She just wanted to see her father. He typed back one word. Soon. Outside the window, the city skyline began to peek through the haze, Chicago's steel and glass shimmering beneath the low sun. Inside, the business-class cabin of Flight 377 had changed. Not its layout, not its seats, but its air. It was no longer neutral, it was accountable. And the man in seat 3A sat quietly, ready to finish what he'd started. The forward intercom crackled again, and the captain's voice returned, even and composed. We'll begin our descent into Chicago shortly. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Flight attendants, prepare for arrival. He stood beside the arrival gate podium, no microphones, no script, and said, Yes, I was in seat 3A, and yes, I was told I didn't belong. Thaddeus Avery's voice was calm, steady, not the kind of voice that tried to dominate a room, but the kind that made the room hold its breath. Just beyond the security barrier at Gate 14 in Chicago, O'Hare's Terminal C, a group of passengers and staff stood clustered, silent. A few corporate aides from Silverwing HQ had arrived in a rush, expecting chaos press flashes, outbursts, an executive storming down the jet bridge. Instead, they found him standing in front of a glass wall overlooking the tarmac, speaking to the moment like it was a person that owed him a straight answer. I wasn't mistaken. I wasn't out of place, Thaddeus said. I was misjudged, and so were the values we claim to stand for. The group stood motionless. Malcolm Tate stood to his left, flanked by 2 legal reps and the newly arrived Director of Public Affairs. None of them said a word. I built this company on the promise that everyone deserves the same standard of dignity, not depending on their last name, or the cut of their suit, or the color of their skin. But today, that promise was broken in a cabin that bears my design. He looked up, eyes clear, face unreadable but resolute. So from this moment forward, we're not just managing optics, we're leading transformation. There was no applause, no dramatic swell of sound, just the soft hush of people realizing they were standing at the edge of a cultural shift. Inside a nearby conference room, a small team from Silverwing's corporate office stood around a table strewn with laptops and legal pads. Most were from communications and HR, brought in quickly to handle the fallout. But when Thaddeus entered the room minutes later, they instinctively moved aside. He walked to the head of the table, loosened the collar of his dark jacket, and placed his worn notebook on the polished oak surface. First, he said, you don't speak. You listen. Chairs creaked as everyone sat. What happened on Flight 377 wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a rogue employee. It was the symptom of a culture we allowed to calcify beneath the surface. And if this company intends to survive another decade, we're going to burn that layer off starting today. A junior staffer, legal, based on his badge, started to say something, but Thaddeus cut in gently. You'll have your turn, but not now. He opened his notebook and read from the list aloud. Number 1. Mandatory equity and bias training for all crew and customer-facing staff, renewed annually. Number 2. A permanent anonymous reporting system to capture bias and misconduct. Number 3. A full audit of our staffing and customer treatment history, 90 days, minimum. And number 4. Public correction, not public relations. Malcolm nodded. It's ready to go. We've drafted the initial policy updates. All we need is your green light. Thaddeus didn't hesitate. Start it. Call it the Skyline Protocol. Launch today. The HR director looked up from her notes. Sir, what about the flight crew from 377? Thaddeus didn't blink. Clarissa Denton is to be placed on immediate leave. Her file needs to be reviewed. If there's a pattern, we won't wait. What about the captain? He'll be part of the advisory panel, Thaddeus said. He came around, eventually. That still counts for something. No one disagreed. No one tried to soften the terms. This wasn't a moment for soft edges. Let's also acknowledge the people who showed courage, he continued. Naomi Brooks. She checked the manifest. She returned to the conversation. I want her promoted to Director of Cabin Culture, effective immediately. Malcolm scribbled notes. We'll handle the onboarding. Another staffer raised a hand timidly. And the messaging? Thaddeus shook his head. No press release yet? Not until I speak directly to the team. He walked over to the window, looked down at the tarmac below. Planes moved slowly in the distance, their silhouettes sharp against the early evening glow. I want a live address streamed to every Silverwing employee across every department by tonight. No music, no branded backdrop, just me. One chair, one camera, one truth. They began to move, each person now set into motion by a leadership style that needed no dramatics, just direction. Down in the terminal, the story had already begun to leak beyond internal channels. A local reporter who had been tipped off by a ground crew member had snapped a blurry photo of Thaddeus walking back into the terminal. Within 30 minutes, it had been reposted hundreds of times with variations of the same caption. Black CEO humiliated on own airline. Responds not with rage, but with reform. And as the image spread, so did curiosity. Passengers from Flight 377 began sharing quiet recollections of what they had witnessed. Some praised the poise, others admitted their complicity, but all recognized the weight of what had unfolded mid-air. Back in the secure wing of the airport, Malcolm approached Thaddeus with a secure tablet. Sir, we've got the stream link set up. You'll be broadcast to 38,000 employees. Ready when you are. Thaddeus sat in the chair they had set up, no logos, no lighting rig, just a blank wall behind him. He adjusted the mic slightly and folded his hands in his lap. A long breath passed between him and the silence. Then the countdown blinked. Live in 3, 1. He looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this, he said, you've probably heard about what happened on Flight 377. I won't retell the story. It's already out there. He paused, letting the air settle. What I want to talk about is what it revealed not just about a few people, but about all of us. Our blind spots, our habits, the assumptions we carry, and the silence we defend. And if I, your CEO, can be told to move to the back of a plane on my own airline, then you can be sure our passengers, especially those who don't have titles, are experiencing worse. His voice didn't rise. It deepened. I'm not angry. I'm awake, and I hope you are too. He laid out the Skyline protocol. One by one. Each initiative. Each reform. Not as a crisis response, but as a cultural blueprint. This company doesn't need more policies. It needs a spine, and it needs heart. So let's build both. Not for show, but for good. The feed ended without a logo, just a slow fade to black. That night, Naomi Brooks received an email with the subject line, Your promotion, effective immediately. Her hands trembled as she read it twice, then 3 more times. A smile formed not the bright kind, but the quiet kind that comes from being seen. Elsewhere, on a street in Oak Park, Illinois, a woman named Linda Chu wrote a letter to Silverwing's public inbox. She explained what she'd witnessed, what it meant. And then she attached a receipt, a donation of $5,000 to a scholarship fund in Thaddeus Avery's name, supporting young black students pursuing aviation careers. "I call this," she wrote, "my quiet apology." Back in the Chicago terminal, Thaddeus stepped out into the cold air, night settling over the city. The lights from the tower blinked rhythmically behind him. At the curb, a black town car waited. As the door opened, he turned once to glance back at the terminal, at the windows, the gates, the lights. It looked the same, but he knew it wasn't. The next morning, a new flight crew would find a sealed memo waiting at their stations. It would begin with one line. "Leadership isn't about how high you sit. It's about whether you stand when it matters." Back in a quiet conference room in the city, Thaddeus Avery opened his laptop, reviewed the names of 30 staff members across the country, flagged for review, and added one more name to the internal promotion shortlist: Naomi Brooks. And at that same moment, a notification pinged on Malcolm Tate's phone. "Sir, Flight 728 is requesting a culture officer on board. Shall we assign Director Brooks to ride along?" He typed back 2 words: "Let her fly." There are stories that end with fireworks, and then there are stories that end in silence, the kind of silence that comes when truth has settled into a room, into a company, into a country. This was that kind of story. It did not need a raised voice or a courtroom. It did not end with shouting or vengeance. It ended with clarity, with policy bending to principle, with quiet dignity overpowering loud ignorance. From the moment Thaddeus Avery sat down in seat 3A, a collision was set in motion not between people, but between values, between perception and reality, between what companies say they stand for and what they tolerate in their culture when no one's watching. The flight attendant who told him to move didn't just misjudge a man, she misjudged the moment. Because that moment didn't end when the seatbelt sign turned off. It unfolded across 6 chapters of reckoning. Thaddeus never raised his voice. He didn't have to. That is the power of someone who knows who he is, even when others choose not to see it. He bore the humiliation not with rage, but with restraint, not with panic, but with principle. He didn't walk down that jet bridge looking to fire back. He walked with purpose, carrying a notebook instead of a grudge. That kind of strength doesn't come from status. It comes from a lifetime of endurance, a history of being underestimated, and the wisdom to know that true reform is quieter than revenge, but louder in its impact. The beauty of Thaddeus's response is that it was never just personal. Yes, he had been wronged. Yes, his dignity had been insulted in a public space. But he knew that what happened to him was just a magnified version of what happens to so many others who don't carry his title or his platform. And so he didn't just demand an apology. He built a protocol. He didn't demand a headline, he demanded a shift in how people were treated from the first moment they walked onto a plane, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. This story reminds us that policy without integrity is just paper, that a mission statement is only as strong as the culture it produces, and that the real measure of a company or a country is how it treats the people it thinks can't fight back. The truth is, everyone notices. The people in the back rows, the ones in uniform, the ones just trying to get home. They all notice who gets believed and who gets doubted, who is greeted with warmth and who is treated like a problem. But this time, someone stood up. Or more precisely, he stayed seated, refused to move, refused to disappear. And in doing so, he exposed more than one woman's prejudice. He exposed a system's blind spots. Along the way, others found their voices too. Naomi Brooks, a flight attendant who saw the truth in real time and chose to act. She didn't do it for applause. She did it because it was right. Because she remembered that her uniform was not just a brand, it was a responsibility. And in that moment, she became more than just an employee. She became a bridge between silence and justice. Linda Chu, a passenger who began the flight as a bystander, ended it with a voice. She watched. She admitted. She apologized. And most importantly, she changed, and that is no small thing. Small, because stories like this are not just about heroes and villains. They are about all the people in the middle. The ones who have to decide whether to speak, to act, or to stay silent. Even Gregory Vance, the corporate lawyer who tried to sidestep discomfort, had a choice. And when the moment came, he chose reflection over retreat. Not because he had to, but because he saw, maybe for the first time, the cost of his neutrality. The lesson here is layered. That silence is not neutral. That leadership is not about titles. That change does not come from press statements, but from culture shifts. That justice is not just about what happens in courtrooms, but in cabins, lobbies, classrooms, and everyday interactions where someone chooses to see or not to see the full dignity of another. In the end, Thaddeus didn't just restore his own dignity, he restored the compass of a company. He reminded every person watching that quiet strength is not weakness, that refusing to be moved is sometimes the loudest statement you can make. The Skyline Protocol will now live in every crew briefing, every employee orientation, every corner of Silver Wing's operations. But more importantly, it lives in the minds of every person who saw what happened and realized something needed to change. That's how you know a story matters. Not because it goes viral, but because it turns into values. Thaddeus Avery will be remembered not for how high he sat, but for how deeply he stood, for how he answered bias with blueprint, for how he transformed injustice into infrastructure. His story is one that teaches without preaching, that humbles without humiliating, that empowers without spectacle. Because dignity doesn't demand the spotlight. It simply endures, and then when the moment is right, it speaks. And that is the kind of justice that lasts. The philosophy remains. Leadership is not about position, it is about presence. The willingness to show up, to speak up, and to never sit down when the seat offered, is injustice. If you felt this story in your heart, if it reminded you of something you've lived, or something you hope never happens again, leave a number 1 in the comments. And if you believe that stories like this deserve to be heard, if you believe in justice, quiet strength, and the power of dignity, subscribe to our channel to hear the next story.